He thought he was about to entertain the room, but he had just chosen the worst opponent of his life. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the gym, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor, where echoes of footsteps and muted conversations blended into a steady hum of anticipation. And in the center of it all stood a man everyone admired, a black belt whose reputation filled the room before he even spoke, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning every newcomer with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced because it was already understood. And that was when she walked in, unnoticed at first, just another woman in simple clothes, her sneakers worn, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had stepped into the wrong place, or perhaps into a place she already understood better than anyone there. And no one paid her much attention, not at first, because the gym was used to people like her, curious visitors, beginners who came in thinking they could learn something in a few sessions, people who didn't last, people who didn't belong. And yet there was something about the way she moved, not hesitant, not impressed, just steady, controlled, almost deliberate, like every step had already been measured long before she took it. And across the room, the black belt noticed her, not because she stood out, but because she didn't try to, his gaze lingering for a second longer than usual. Curiosity mixed with quiet amusement forming at the corner of his mouth, because in his world, people revealed themselves quickly, through posture, through confidence, through the way they carried their weight. And she, to him, looked like someone who would fold under pressure, someone who would hesitate, someone who would provide a moment of light entertainment for the rest of the class. And that thought alone was enough to make him step forward, the subtle shift in his movement drawing attention from the others, conversations fading as people turned, sensing something was about to happen, because in this place, moments like these were never accidental. They were orchestrated, shaped by ego and expectation. And as he approached her, the air seemed to tighten, a quiet circle forming without anyone needing to say a word, the kind of unspoken arrangement that happens when a group anticipates something worth watching. And she stopped walking, turning her head slightly toward him, her eyes meeting his with a calm that didn't challenge but didn't retreat either. And for a brief second, something flickered in his expression, something he didn't quite recognize. But it passed quickly, replaced by the familiar confidence he wore so effortlessly. And when he spoke, his voice carried just enough volume for others to hear, just enough tone to make it sound like a suggestion rather than a setup. But everyone knew exactly what it was. "First time here?" he asked, though the answer didn't matter, because the question itself was already part of the performance. And she nodded once. A simple motion, no explanation, no attempt to justify her presence. And that only seemed to amuse him more, because silence, in a place like this, was often mistaken for uncertainty, and uncertainty was easy to control, easy to expose, easy to turn into something the crowd could react to. And around them, a few quiet chuckles began to ripple, subtle at first, then growing just enough to signal where the energy of the room was heading. And he glanced briefly at the others, feeding off that energy, shaping it, turning it into something sharper, something more directed, because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about maintaining the hierarchy everyone believed in, the invisible structure that placed him firmly at the top, and her somewhere far below. And as he tilted his head slightly, studying her with that same measured look, he made a decision, one that felt casual in the moment, but would soon define everything that followed. Because in his mind, this was simple, predictable, another easy demonstration of skill and control, another reminder to everyone watching of who belonged and who didn't. And yet, beneath the surface, something else was already in motion, something no one in that room could see. Not yet, because while they saw a quiet woman standing alone, she carried something entirely different, something built in silence, shaped over years, something that didn't need attention to exist. And as the room settled into a quiet expectancy, the kind that makes every small movement feel amplified, she didn't shift, didn't speak, didn't react to the growing tension around her. And that stillness, unnoticed by most, was the first sign that this moment was never going to unfold the way they thought it would. The faint smile on his lips lingered just long enough for the others to notice. And that was all it took for the atmosphere to shift from casual curiosity to something sharper, something expectant, as if the room itself had agreed on what was about to happen, and one of the younger students leaned slightly toward his friend, whispering just loud enough to be heard, asking if she even knew where she was, while another chuckled under his breath, already anticipating the outcome they believed was inevitable, because in this place, outcomes were usually predictable, shaped by rank, by experience, by the visible markers stitched into belts and worn like badges of identity. And she had none of those markers, nothing that signaled belonging, nothing that demanded respect, at least not in a way they could recognize. And the black belt took another step closer, slow and deliberate, giving her space, but also defining the boundary she now stood within, a boundary that everyone else instinctively respected. And his voice came again, slightly louder this time, carrying across the room with an easy confidence that felt almost casual. "You want to try something?" he asked, though the question was never really a question, because the tone made it clear that this was an invitation designed to be accepted, not declined. And a few heads turned fully now, conversations fading into silence as attention gathered, drawn by the familiar pattern they had seen many times before. Someone new stepping into a situation they did not fully understand, someone about to learn their place. And she looked at him, not quickly, not nervously, but with the same steady gaze that had not changed since the moment she entered. And for a second, there was no response, just that quiet pause that stretched a little longer than expected, enough to make the air feel heavier, enough to make a few people shift their weight uncomfortably, as if the rhythm of the scene had been interrupted in a way they could not quite explain. And then she gave a small nod, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, and the reaction was immediate, a ripple of amused energy spreading through the group, a few soft laughs, a few raised eyebrows, the kind of reaction that came from people who believed they were about to witness something entertaining rather than meaningful. And the black belt exhaled softly, almost satisfied, as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned, because in his mind, this was control, this was structure, this was the natural order of things being reaffirmed in front of everyone watching. And he gestured toward the center of the mat, a subtle motion that carried authority without needing force. And she stepped forward without hesitation, her movements still calm, still measured, as if the growing attention around her did not exist. And that alone began to create a faint, almost imperceptible tension, because confidence usually announced itself loudly in places like this. But hers did not. It stayed quiet, contained, and difficult to read. And as they reached the center, the circle around them tightened slightly, people adjusting their positions to get a better view, phones subtly raised, not overtly, but enough to capture what they assumed would be a brief, predictable moment. And one of the assistants crossed his arms, watching with a faint smirk, while another shook his head slightly, already certain of the outcome. And the black belt rolled his shoulders once, loosening up, the movement fluid and practiced, a display of readiness that did not need to be exaggerated. And then he looked at her again, this time with a hint of something more deliberate, something closer to performance. And he spoke in a tone that carried just enough edge to draw a reaction. "Do not worry, I will keep it simple," he said, the words landing exactly as intended, drawing a few louder laughs now, because the implication was clear, and the room responded accordingly, feeding off the moment, reinforcing the imbalance that everyone could see but no one questioned. And she stood there, unchanged, her posture steady, her expression calm, as if the words had passed right through her without leaving a mark. And that was when the first real shift began, subtle but undeniable, because while the others heard amusement, something else was forming beneath the surface, something quieter, something far more controlled. And as the noise in the room slowly faded into a focused silence, the space between them seemed to narrow, not physically, but in a way that made everything else feel distant. And in that narrowing space, the assumption that had filled the room from the beginning began to feel just a little less certain. The air in the room settled into a strange, almost unnatural stillness, the kind that comes not from silence alone, but from expectation pressing in from every direction. And for a brief moment, no one moved, not even the ones who had been laughing seconds earlier, because something in her stillness had begun to interrupt the rhythm they were used to. And the black belt noticed it too, though he did not acknowledge it, instead shifting his stance slightly, testing the space between them with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, his confidence intact, his presence controlled. And yet there was a flicker, subtle and quick, that crossed his expression when she did not mirror his movement the way most beginners did, when she did not fidget, did not glance around, did not betray even the smallest sign of uncertainty. And in that moment, the first crack appeared, invisible to the crowd but unmistakable to him, because he was trained to read people, to anticipate hesitation, to respond to imbalance. And she offered him none of it. And instead she stood exactly as she had before, her weight evenly distributed, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed but not aggressive, simply aware, and that awareness carried a quiet depth that did not match the role they had already assigned to her. And someone in the circle shifted their phone slightly, adjusting the angle, whispering that this might actually be interesting, while another person frowned, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they expected to see. And the assistant who had been smirking earlier lowered his arms just a fraction, his posture no longer as relaxed, because even without understanding why, he could feel that something was different, and the black belt stepped in just a little closer, not initiating anything, just closing the distance enough to observe her reaction. And again, there was none, no flinch, no retreat, just that same calm presence, and it forced him to pause, a fraction of a second longer than he intended. And in that fraction, the dynamic shifted again, ever so slightly, because hesitation, even when hidden, has a weight to it. And the room felt it, even if they could not name it. And she finally moved, not forward, not backward, but just enough to adjust her footing, a small, precise motion that aligned her stance in a way that looked simple but carried a quiet precision. And that was when it began to register, not as a realization, not yet, but as a question forming in the back of a few minds, a question that disrupted the certainty they had all shared only moments ago. And the black belt inhaled slowly, steadying himself, his expression tightening just enough to show focus rather than amusement now. And he spoke again, though his tone had shifted, less performative, more measured. Relax, he said, as if reminding her, but the words seemed to hang in the air without finding its mark, because she was already relaxed, more than anyone else in that room. And that realization unsettled him in a way he did not expect. And for the first time since she had entered, he was no longer entirely in control of the narrative unfolding around them. And the crowd sensed it, not consciously, but through the subtle change in energy, the absence of easy laughter, the tightening of attention, the way people leaned in just slightly, as if trying to see something that was no longer obvious. And in the center of it all, she remained exactly as she was, calm, composed, and quietly present, like someone who had been here before, not in this room, not with these people, but in moments like this, moments where expectations were loud and truth was silent. And as the seconds stretched just a little longer than they should have, it became clear, though no one would say it yet, that this was no longer going to be a simple demonstration, and whatever came next would not belong to the script they had all assumed from the start. The tension that had been building quietly beneath the surface finally began to reveal itself, not through sudden movement, but through the subtle collapse of certainty that had once filled the room. And the black belt, who had always relied on reading the smallest cues, now found himself searching for something that was not there, no hesitation, no imbalance, no predictable reaction. And that absence created a pressure he could not easily dismiss. So he decided to take control the only way he knew how, by escalating the moment just enough to force a response. And he shifted his weight forward, a controlled step that usually prompted immediate adjustment from anyone across from him. A signal, a test, a quiet demand for acknowledgement. But she did not react the way he expected. Instead, she mirrored the distance with a precision so subtle it almost went unnoticed, maintaining the same calm space between them, as if she had already calculated the movement before he made it. And a faint murmur spread through the circle, not laughter this time, but something closer to confusion, as a few observers exchanged glances, sensing that the pattern they relied on was no longer holding together. And one of the assistants leaned slightly forward, his earlier confidence fading into focus, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what he was seeing, because this was not how beginners moved. This was not how uncertainty behaved. And the black belt felt it too, that quiet resistance that was not forceful but undeniable, like stepping into a current that looked calm on the surface but carried something deeper beneath. And he adjusted again, this time quicker, sharper, expecting to break through that stillness, to provoke something, anything that would restore the familiar dynamic. But again, she responded with the same measured control, her movement minimal, efficient, leaving no openings, no excess. And that was when the shift became undeniable, because it was no longer just him who felt it. The entire room felt it, the subtle but unmistakable realization that this was not unfolding as expected, and the phones that had been raised casually were now held steady, no longer for amusement, but for documentation. As if people instinctively understood that something worth remembering was about to happen, and the laughter had completely disappeared, replaced by a focused silence that pressed in from every side. And he exhaled slowly, his posture tightening just enough to signal concentration rather than display. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier lightness, now carrying a deliberate edge. "Stay ready," he said, though it sounded less like instruction and more like a reminder to himself. And she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the moment without breaking her composure. And in that brief exchange, something deeper passed between them, not spoken, not visible, but understood, because for the first time, he recognized that he was not guiding this moment anymore. He was reacting to it, and that realization settled heavily. Even as he tried to maintain control, and around them, the circle tightened once more, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect for something they could not yet name. And in the center of it all, she remained exactly the same, grounded, composed, her presence quiet, but unshakable. And as the seconds stretched into a silence that no one dared to interrupt, it became clear that whatever happened next would not be a demonstration, it would be a revelation, and not everyone in that room was prepared for what they were about to witness. And then it happened, not with a sudden burst of action, but with a shift so precise that most of the room almost missed it, a small adjustment in her stance, a subtle change in the angle of her shoulders, the kind of movement that carried intention without drawing attention. And in that instant, the black belt stepped forward with the expectation of control, initiating what he believed would guide the flow back into something familiar, something predictable. But the moment his movement entered her space, it became clear that the rhythm no longer belonged to him, because she responded not with resistance, not with force, but with timing, exact and effortless, redirecting the energy of the moment in a way that required no strain, no visible exertion, just an understanding so refined that it unfolded almost invisibly. And the shift was immediate, his balance interrupted not by impact but by absence, as if the structure he relied on had simply not been there when he expected it. And the room reacted with a collective intake of breath, a sharp, synchronized silence replacing the low murmur that had filled the space before. And he recovered quickly, his training undeniable, stepping back into position with a controlled expression. But the flicker of surprise in his eyes could not be hidden, not from those who were watching closely, not from those who had begun to understand that this was no longer a demonstration of superiority, but something else entirely. And she remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the moment that had just unsettled the entire room was simply another step in a process she had repeated countless times before. And that calm was what made it undeniable, because confidence could be performed, but this was not performance. This was certainty, quiet and unshakable. And he circled slightly now, more cautious, his movements still controlled but no longer casual, testing angles, searching for something he could rely on. But each attempt met the same response, not opposition, but absence, a precise redirection that left him with nothing to anchor to. And the crowd felt it building, the tension rising not from speed or aggression, but from the growing realization that the roles had begun to reverse. And one of the students lowered his phone slowly, his earlier amusement replaced by focused attention, while another leaned forward, his expression tightening as understanding began to replace assumption. And then came the moment that sealed it, subtle yet undeniable, when she stepped forward for the first time. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a calm decision that shifted the entire dynamic, her movement clean, efficient, leaving no room for misinterpretation, And in that single step, she controlled the distance, the timing, the narrative itself, and he responded instinctively. But it was already too late, because the control had changed hands, not through dominance, but through precision. And the result unfolded in a matter of seconds, a sequence so clean and controlled that it left no space for doubt, no room for debate. And when it ended, there was no dramatic collapse, no spectacle, just a stillness, a quiet conclusion that spoke louder than anything else could have. And the black belt stood there, his posture intact but his certainty gone, his expression frozen in a moment of realization that he could not yet process. And around them, the room had fallen completely silent, not out of shock alone, but out of recognition, because what they had just witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, but mastery, revealed without announcement, proven without excess. And in that silence, every assumption that had filled the room at the beginning was gone, replaced by something far heavier, something far more difficult to ignore. For a long moment, no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because there was nothing that could be said that would not sound smaller than what they had just witnessed, and the silence settled over the room like a weight, pressing down on every assumption that had filled the space only minutes earlier. And the black belt remained where he was, his posture still composed out of habit, but his eyes no longer carried the same certainty. Instead, they searched, not the room, not the people around him, but her, as if trying to find an explanation that would restore the order he had always relied on. And she stood a few feet away, exactly where she had finished, her breathing even, her expression calm, as if the moment had passed through her without leaving any trace. And that was what unsettled him most, not the outcome itself, but the absence of effort, the lack of display, the quiet control that had defined every second of the exchange. And someone in the circle shifted, the soft sound of a shoe against the wooden floor echoing louder than it should have, breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone they were still there, still watching, still trying to understand. And one of the younger students lowered his gaze, the earlier amusement gone, replaced by something closer to discomfort, as if he had just realized that what he found entertaining had been built on something he did not fully understand. And another student slowly put his phone down, no longer recording, as if the moment deserved something more than being captured on a screen. And the assistant who had been watching so closely took a step back, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer confident, because the structure he trusted had just been challenged in a way he could not easily explain. And the black belt finally spoke, but when he did, his voice was quieter, stripped of the tone he had carried before. "Where did you train?" he asked, the question simple, but the weight behind it unmistakable, because it was no longer asked out of curiosity, but out of necessity. And she looked at him, her eyes steady, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she might not answer at all. But then she spoke, her voice calm, almost soft. "Different places," she said, and nothing more. No details, no explanation, just enough to acknowledge the question without satisfying it. And that answer lingered in the air, incomplete, but somehow complete enough to confirm what everyone was beginning to understand. And he nodded slowly, not because he fully understood, but because he recognized something he could not deny. And the room remained quiet, not out of shock anymore, but out of respect, a shift that had happened without anyone announcing it, without anyone deciding it, simply because the truth of what they had seen left no other response. And she adjusted her stance slightly, stepping back just enough to return the space between them to what it had been before, not claiming anything, not demanding anything, just restoring balance in a way that felt intentional. And that gesture, small as it was, carried more weight than any display could have, because it showed that she had never been there to prove anything, never been there to take anything, only to respond when she was pushed into the moment. And the black belt exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a way that signaled acceptance rather than defeat. And as he looked around the room, he could see it in their faces, the change, the shift from certainty to awareness, from judgment to reflection. And in that shared silence, the lesson had already settled, not spoken, not explained, but understood, because what they had witnessed was not just skill, it was restraint, not just control, but humility. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away, the room did not move, did not speak, did not interrupt, Because in that moment, everyone understood that something had been revealed, something that could not be undone, and it stayed with them, in the quiet, long after the moment itself had ended. She did not rush to leave, and that, more than anything, held the room in place, because there was no sense of escape in her movement, no urgency to disappear after what had just happened, only a quiet decision to remain present for a moment longer, as if allowing the weight of it all to settle naturally. And the black belt watched her, no longer with the eyes of someone assessing a challenge, but with the attention of someone trying to understand a reality that had shifted beneath him. And he took a slow step forward, not to reclaim space, but to close a distance that now felt different, more balanced, more honest. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier performance, none of the subtle condescension that had once shaped his words. "I misjudged you," he said, each word deliberate, measured, as if he understood that anything less would fall short of what the moment required. And the room absorbed it instantly, because acknowledgement, especially from someone in his position, carried its own kind of impact, one that echoed deeper than the exchange itself. And she looked at him, her expression unchanged, not softened by the admission, not hardened by what had come before, simply steady, as if she had never needed the recognition to begin with. And she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as victory, but as acknowledgement, the same quiet gesture she had offered at the beginning. And that symmetry did not go unnoticed, because it revealed something the others had not seen before, that her presence had never been shaped by their perception. It had remained constant from the moment she entered. And that realization settled heavily across the room, shifting the way they saw not just her, but themselves. And one of the students, the same one who had laughed earlier, now looked down at the floor, his expression tight, as if replaying his own reaction and finding it lacking, while another stepped slightly back, giving space not out of instruction, but out of instinct, because respect, once earned in that way, demanded it without being asked. And the assistant who had been watching so closely finally exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his posture relaxing into something more grounded, more aware. And the black belt held her gaze for a moment longer, then inclined his head, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words could have, because it was not just acknowledgement of skill, but recognition of something deeper, something he had overlooked. And she turned then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled ease that had defined every movement she had made. And as she stepped away from the center, the circle opened without hesitation, people shifting back to create a path, not because they were told to, but because they understood. And the sound of her footsteps was soft against the wooden floor, steady, unhurried, and no one spoke, not as she passed, not even after she moved beyond them, because the silence had taken on a different meaning now, no longer empty, but full, carrying the weight of a lesson that had not been explained, only experienced. And as she reached the edge of the room, she paused for the briefest moment, not turning back, not seeking anything, just allowing the moment to complete itself. And behind her, the black belt remained where he was, still, reflective, his earlier certainty replaced by something far more valuable, something harder to earn. And in that stillness, the entire room understood that what had happened would not fade quickly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, because it had revealed something real, something that could not be dismissed or forgotten. And as the quiet slowly began to loosen, as small movements returned and breath found its rhythm again, the shift remained, subtle but permanent, like a line drawn that could never be unseen. And in that space, respect was no longer given lightly, and judgment no longer came as easily as it had before. The door did not close behind her immediately, and that small detail held the room suspended in a quiet that no one was ready to break, because even as she stepped away, the presence she had carried remained, lingering in the air like something unfinished, something that demanded reflection before it could be released. And the black belt stood still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed not on her now, but on the space where she had been, as if trying to trace back every second, every assumption, every miscalculation that had led him to that moment. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about control or reputation or the structure of the room around him. He was thinking about understanding, about the difference between what is seen and what is real, and that thought settled deeper than any lesson he had ever delivered. And around him, the students began to shift, slowly at first, as if unsure whether they were allowed to move again, and one of them cleared his throat quietly, the sound almost hesitant, as if speaking now required permission that had not existed before, and another stepped closer to the center of the mat, looking down at the floor where the moment had unfolded, as if expecting to find some trace of it there, some visible mark that could explain what they had just witnessed. But there was nothing, only the same polished wood, unchanged, indifferent, and that absence made it clearer than anything else could have, because what had happened was not something that could be left behind. It had already moved into them, into the way they would think, the way they would judge, the way they would approach the next person who walked through that door. And the assistant who had once smirked now looked toward the entrance, his expression thoughtful, as if he was seeing it differently, not as a boundary to protect, but as a threshold that could no longer be defined by appearances alone. And the black belt finally turned, his movement slow, deliberate, and he addressed the room, not with authority, not with instruction, but with a tone that carried something quieter, something more grounded. "What you saw," he began, pausing briefly, choosing his words carefully, "was not just skill," and the silence that followed was complete, every person listening in a way they had not before, because now every word mattered. And he continued, "It was discipline, patience, and control that does not need to be proven." And as he spoke, the weight of his earlier certainty seemed to fall away, replaced by something far more genuine, and no one interrupted, no one reacted outwardly, but the shift was there, undeniable. And as he finished, he did not add anything more, because there was nothing else to add, and the room remained quiet for a few seconds longer before the natural sounds of movement slowly returned, shoes against the floor, quiet breaths, small adjustments. But even those sounds carried a different tone now, softer, more aware, and near the entrance. One of the students glanced outside, catching a brief glimpse of her figure as she walked away, already blending into the ordinary world beyond the gym. And that image stayed with him, because it made something clear that could not be ignored, that the most extraordinary presence in that room had arrived without announcement and left without expectation. And that realization settled deeply, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet truth, one that would surface again and again long after this moment had passed. And as the door finally closed, the sound was gentle, almost unnoticeable, but it marked the end of something that would not truly end, because what remained was not the moment itself, but the understanding it left behind. And in that understanding, the room was no longer the same, even if everything in it looked exactly as it had before. The following morning, the gym looked exactly the same. Sunlight stretching across the wooden floor, the faint scent of effort and routine lingering in the air, students arriving one by one, tying their belts, warming up, speaking in low voices that carried the rhythm of familiarity. And yet something beneath that routine had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, because the memory of what had happened the day before had not faded. It had settled, shaping the way each person entered the space, the way they looked at one another, the way they held themselves in the silence between movements. And the black belt stood near the center, watching as the class gathered, his posture as composed as ever, but his gaze different now, less about scanning for weakness, more about observing without assumption. And when the door opened again, even though it was just another student stepping in, a few heads turned instinctively, as if expecting the unexpected, as if something in them had learned to look twice, to question the surface. And that alone was enough to reveal how deeply the moment had reached. And the assistant who had once judged so quickly now greeted a newcomer with a simple nod, no longer measuring them by appearance, no longer placing them into categories before they had even spoken. And across the room, two students who had laughed the day before stood quieter than usual, their focus sharper, their movements more deliberate, as if they were trying to understand not just technique, but the mindset behind it. And when the session began, there was a noticeable difference in the way instructions were given. Less emphasis on display, more on awareness, more on control, more on the kind of discipline that could not be seen at a glance. And the black belt spoke with a calm authority that carried something new, something grounded in reflection rather than certainty. "Do not assume," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room without effort. "What you see is only the surface." And no one questioned it. No one reacted with surprise, because they had already experienced the truth of those words. And as the class moved through their drills, there was a quiet respect in the way they engaged with each other, a recognition that skill was not always visible, that strength did not always announce itself, and that understanding created a different kind of environment, one where attention replaced judgment, where patience replaced arrogance, and outside, beyond the walls of the gym, the world moved as it always did, people passing by, unaware of the shift that had taken place. Within, unaware that a simple moment had redefined the way an entire room understood presence and power, and somewhere in that ordinary world, she continued her day without pause, without acknowledgement, carrying the same quiet strength that had never needed validation. And back inside, as the session came to an end, the black belt remained for a moment after the others had begun to leave, standing in the same spot where everything had changed, and he looked at the empty space with a calm expression, no longer searching for answers, but holding on to the lesson that had been given without words. And in that stillness, the meaning of it all became clear, not as something dramatic, not as something loud, but as something simple and lasting, because true ability does not need to prove itself, and true respect does not come from what is shown, but from what is understood. And that day, without announcement, without ceremony, the room had learned the difference, and it would not forget it.